Good day everyone, you're listening to The Great Everything, a show dedicated to culture, philosophy, and trying to find answers to the question of what makes us human. I'm Patrick, a former banking lawyer who saw the light and quit to devote my existence to, well, that great teaching by Dante Alighieri to Ulysses in the Inferno, that we were not made to live as beasts, but to pursue virtue and knowledge. A couple of months ago, I called my half-brother, and I just found out that my mother has brain cancer, so I was calling him to let him know and talk about it. We commiserated a little and we talked about how awful this was and what it meant for me, my life and my future, the full impact of the situation. And then when I was done, he started talking and he told me about all his worries of the moment, financial and with his family, his daughter, and also he was having trouble with his mother, who's now 85. It was a pretty bleak conversation. And after we've sort of said what we wanted to say and we gotten everything off our chests, there were a few moments of silence. And then my brother said, "Life is just stuff that happens in between bad news." Now, as someone who on a balance is slightly more romantic, I don't really agree with that statement, but still, it does have a ring of truth to it. We spend a lot of our lives worrying about bad news we've received, bad news we might receive. For many of us, the definition of pleasure and happiness isn't even a positive. It's just the absence of anxiety, the absence of suffering. You know, those days where you know, oh my God, there's no pain coming my way, hopefully. I can just sit back and relax and breathe. That's what a good day is. Now, we all know positive happiness exists. I mean, we've all experienced it. Hopefully, we've tasted it. But if we look around us, we soon realize there really is a lot of suffering out there in the world. A lot. And somehow, this is especially the case at times in life when we're just kind of struggling to stay afloat. We might look back and remember those few islands of happiness, of satisfaction, almost as though they were in an ocean of shit. It's almost as though in an average life, pain and worry and anxiety, they kind of outweigh happiness. So here's my question. Would it have been better to never have been born? I know, it's an ugly question, and the answer might be uglier. But this is the kind of question that a school of philosophers known as anti-natalists deal with. On yesterday's episode of the Waking Up podcast, Sam Harris interviewed the prominent anti-natalist David Benatar. He's the author of Better Never to Have Been. And the conversation really got me thinking. I was really uncomfortable too, because here's the thing. I don't agree with antinatalism. I don't think it would be better to never have been born. But I'm not sure that my belief that life is ultimately worth living is based on a sound logical argument. In fact, in order to counter the antinatalist position of philosophers like Benatar, I kind of have to cheat. I gotta bring outside stuff into the mix. Non-scientific stuff like the inherent worth of experience or the beauty of art or the importance of humanity. But then, how does that make me any different from people who invoke God in a scientific argument? So, I want to take a few segments today to discuss antinatalism, its main arguments as I understand them, and to see if we can figure out an actual logical reason why life is still worth living. You don't need to be familiar with the position to enjoy this or get what I'm saying, and you don't have to have listened to the Sam Harris podcast, but I do recommend it, especially if you want to delve deeper into this fascinating topic. Anyway, would it have been better never to have been? A few thoughts on that right after the break.
Hello, the great everything. This is a really great question because it causes you to think.
The great everything ain't nothing to fuck with. The great everything ain't nothing to fuck with. The Patrick Daniel ain't nothing to fuck
Hello,
with.
boys and girls. Welcome to The Great Everything, your source for cultural discoveries.
Can you dig it?
Absolutely loved your little bit about jazz.
Opera is the ultimate art form. It's not just about fat people screaming at each other. Philosophical musings.
Can you dig it?
The uncertainty principle proves we can't ever really know what's going on.
The physical world that we see around us, the room, the stars, galaxies, is just one tiny sliver of the whole of reality.
And other assorted bullshit here on Anchor.
Can you dig it?
Damn it, Patrick! You have meddled with
the primal forces of nature!
It's not an S. In my world, it means hope.
I'm Patrick, a former banking lawyer who saw the light and quit
Being a banking lawyer at one point in your life and then seeing the light.
to dedicate my life to sharing the stuff I love with the people I love.
Hey, I just want to let you know that you are my favorite station on Anchor.
Oh, yeah. And you guys too.
Antinatalism is the view that it is morally reprehensible, or at least irresponsible, to bring beings into existence. Basically, it's immoral to procreate. Now, these are some statistics that David Benatar cites, and they are approximate numbers, obviously. 20,000 people starve to death each day. 840 million people are suffering from hunger and malnutrition as we speak. Over 15 million people have died from natural disasters in the last 1,000 years. And 102 million have died from plague in the last 15 centuries, and 50 million died in the 1918 Spanish flu alone. 11 million people die every year from other infectious diseases, and cancer takes 7 million lives every year. 3.5 million people die every year in accidents, and countless millions have died throughout our history from war and shootings and killings and murders and mass murders and other forms of violent death. And currently, they estimate that somebody commits suicide every 40 seconds. For an average human, the chances of being in an accident or dying a violent death or having a fatal illness is exceptionally high, and that's just the extreme cases. And what about just simple old age? People complain about that all the time, the weak limbs, the creaky joints, the loss of cognitive function. It sucks, I'm told. The point is, if you're alive, you will suffer. Do we really want to bring new humans into this? Do we want to condemn a new person to a life in which pain is so prevalent and inevitable? It'd be like lambs to the slaughter. For an unborn human, we're not even talking abortion yet, but just humans not even conceived yet, could it in fact be better to never even be born? And there's a whole other consideration here that we're ignoring. What about all the suffering that the unborn person will cause if it comes into existence? The harm to any animals it might eat or, contribute to the killing of. Any immoral acts it commits, the heartbreak it causes, the carbon footprint. And the comedian Doug Stanhope, he's got this bit about assholes driving around in Hummers and polluting everything and just destroying the environment. And how that's his reason, those assholes in Hummers, for never having kids. And so he concludes the bit with saying, that's why I prefer anal. Anal sex is good for the environment. Antinatalists, I guess, would agree. People are destined both to cause harm and to suffer harm. So what's the point? In a way, this reasoning sounds a lot like utilitarianism, the idea in ethics that moral acts are those acts that bring about the most good for the most people. Basically, an act is good if it maximizes the good in the world. Then this, antinatalism, is kind of like the flip side of that, sort of a negative utilitarianism, where the focus is on reducing suffering. A good act is one that minimizes the suffering in the world, and any life, even a very fortunate life, is destined to suffer some. The sum of suffering in the universe will just increase, so why bother? But hold on, what about pleasure? Shouldn't the amount of happiness and joy that living human might experience cancel out at least some of the suffering? In this utilitarian accounting game, shouldn't we be weighing potential pleasure against potential pain on the balance sheet? Well, antinatalists like Benatar respond with this argument, and pay close attention because it's kind of like their cool logical move. It's quite interesting. To decide whether being born or not being born is a net good or a net evil, you need to compare outcomes. What would the outcome be if the person came to exist versus if they didn't? If the person exists, there will be some pain, which is bad, and some pleasure, which is good. So let's call it a draw. And the person, if they never came into existence, the fact that they wouldn't suffer at all, the complete absence of suffering is good, right? Because that person doesn't suffer. Nobody suffers. But if the person doesn't exist, there will also be an absence of pleasure that the person would have enjoyed had they been born. Except that absence of pleasure is not a harm. It's not a bad thing because nobody is being deprived of that pleasure. There isn't a person existing who can suffer that loss of happiness. So the absence of pleasure isn't bad, it's neutral. it doesn't cancel out the good that comes from the absence of pain. So here, in the scenario where the person isn't born, according to antinatalists, good versus bad isn't a draw. Good wins. So ultimately, not being born is a net good, whereas being born, well, ultimately it's a draw at best. What do you make of that argument? Let's look at it some more. So we have this argument that a person who comes into the world is destined to suffer, but also to cause a lot of pain, so it's actually better for them not to be born in the first place. This whole argument rests on an asymmetry between pleasure and suffering. So to recap the argument, if I'm born, the pain I suffer is bad, and the pleasure I enjoy is good, so the balance is neutral. If I'm not born, the absence of pain is good, and the absence of pleasure is simply not bad, because there's nobody who can say that they missed out on something. I'm not there to complain about any loss I've suffered. I can't be deprived of something if I don't exist. So the balance, in the case of me not existing, is good. Which means that on a balance, to not be born wins out over to be born. But there's something here that doesn't quite add up. I mean, in the scenario where I'm not born, the antinatalists are saying that the absence of pleasure isn't bad because there's nobody there to be deprived of all the good stuff. So the question is, bad for whom? Who could complain? But then the antinatalists are also saying that the absence of suffering is good, even though I'm still not there, I still don't exist, so I can't enjoy the benefit of there being no pain. This feels a bit like trickery, because I could retort, the absence of my hypothetical suffering can't be good for me because I'm not there. That argument cuts both ways. So the antinatalist David Benatar, he responds to this by pointing at what he claims is a fundamental difference between pain and pleasure. Pain is so much worse than pleasure is good, and there is so much more pain than there is pleasure. Basically, there's a real differential in weight between suffering and enjoyment. The intensity of suffering is just too acute, so the bad really does outweigh the good. The pleasure we miss out on will never matter as much as the suffering we could avoid. And I have to admit, there is an argument here. It might not be a logical argument, but I think that if we asked every person on earth who's ever lived and they answered honestly, most might say that life is more about trying to avoid suffering, pain and poverty and hunger and grief and loss, rather than actively seeking out pleasure. I mean, you and I, we lead very fortunate lives on the highest extreme of peaks of prosperity in all of human history. So we might not realize that for most people, life isn't about picking between different desserts at a restaurant. It's about staying alive. So maybe the reduction of suffering is more morally urgent than the creation of happiness. I guess Buddhism has something to say about that. It's pretty much devoted to this idea that life is suffering. It's a permanent state of dissatisfaction because of the impermanence of everything. And the antidote, of course, is nirvana, which we sometimes describe as bliss, but really it's best viewed as nothingness. So it's kind of like saying that life is a choice between suffering and, at the very best, nothingness. Boy, I mean, this antinatalist position, it kind of feels like they're onto something. This is symmetry, this weight differential between suffering and pleasure. This is why the antinatalists can accrue the benefit of not suffering to a non-existent creature while not accruing the loss of pleasure to that same non-existent creature. Now, I have to say, personally, I disagree from experience, right? Because I've suffered quite a fair share. I had a traumatic experience growing up in Sicily as a teen. I lost my father in a slow and horrifically cruel manner, and my mother right now looks like she's determined to top that. But overall, I consider myself to be exceptionally fortunate and to have a great life. But maybe I'm just one of the lucky few. I have happy privilege. And for most people, there's nothing in the world that could balance out the harm that they suffer every day. And the antinatalist solution to this asymmetry between pain and pleasure is don't bring new beings into the world. Don't create new life. It'll just create more suffering. And sure, maybe there'll be some happiness too, but it'll be occasional and fleeting, and it'll never be enough, except in the most exceptionally fortunate of circumstances. Never enough to outweigh the bad. But if not being alive is better than being alive, what does that say about those of us who are already alive? Could this be a case for suicide? David Benatar's argument that life is so bad that it is immoral to bring new conscious beings into existence, it rests on what he sees as the asymmetry between pain and pleasure. But if we accept this asymmetry, what does that mean for those of us who are already alive? If on a whole, sentience entails more suffering than happiness, why should we want to continue to exist? Could it be that we might all just be better off ending our existence? Many, but by no means all antinatalists hold the second position, the idea that not only it would have been better to never have been, but that it would also be better to no longer be. In essence, that we should all just commit suicide, and this view is known as pro-mortalism. This kind of reminds me of the Epicurean idea on death. Quick tangent here. Epicure was a Greek philosopher who founded a school of thought that was in many ways quite similar to Stoicism, but with an additional focus on enjoying the earthly delights, you know? So if you call someone an Epicurean now, what you usually mean is that they're some kind of hedonist. To ultra-simplify, because Epicureanism is really a very complex philosophy, the Epicureans would say that if there's not much that we can do about where we end up in life, we might as well just enjoy the ride. Anyway, Epicure had an idea about death and an answer to those of us who fear it. He said, death is nothing to fear, because when we are here, death isn't. And when death is here, we aren't. So why should we fear something that is never there at the same time as us? It's a bit of a simplistic argument, but it does call to mind the antinatalist view that I expanded on in the past segment, that if someone were never born, it doesn't matter that they'll miss out on awesome stuff like Charlie Parker or All-Star Superman and The Wire, because they won't be around to be deprived of anything. So back to the main question now. Is antinatalism an argument in favor of death? Well, not necessarily, because maybe non-life really is better than life, but death isn't quite the same as non-life. First of all, because death entails suffering, the way you die, or for the people who love you and around you, and the whole point of antinatalism is to reduce suffering. But even if we leave all that aside and we don't consider the suffering in the circumstances of death, the fact of death itself still involves losing something. Losing your life, losing your dreams, losing any project you had an interest in and that you wanted to see fulfilled. You're being deprived, and sure, it won't matter to you after death, but at some point there is a you who does or did care about those things. To that person, a loss does accrue in death. It seems like it's reasonable to say that there is a difference between never having had the opportunity to have something or having the opportunity and then losing it. When I'm personally thinking about never having been born in the first place, I say I prefer to have been born. And that's really because I think of all the things I love. You know, I value beauty, I value art and music, and I just love donuts so much, and my heart just melts every time I stumble upon Golda sleeping in some stupid new position. And then I think about not having all those things, and I think, nah, I prefer having them. But my thinking comes from a place where I do have them. So when I'm thinking about not having them, it feels like I'm losing something. Losing something is probably worse than never having had it. Yes, notwithstanding the phrase, better to have loved and lost than to never have loved at all. You know, it's funny. Last night I got a message from a good friend who had heard the earlier segment, which ended with the phrase, I think, could this be a case for suicide? Knowing my life circumstances, he expressed concern that I was having dark thoughts. Simmer down, everyone, I'm not suicidal. Not only do I have a lot to live for, I mean, the final season of The Americans is still a year out, but also, While I find some of the arguments for antinatalism compelling, I just don't think they also require us to accept pro-mortalism. There really does seem to be a difference between asking whether life is worth coming into in the first place and asking whether it's worth continuing. In the latter case, I would say definitely yes, at least for me. So, glad we've got that cleared up. Now, let's take some call-ins.
Hey Patrick, in behavioral economics there's a theory called prospect theory that says that people will make decisions to limit loss over something that will be an equal or greater gain for them. They will decide to limit the loss or suffering instead of the thing that could net them more success, more happiness, and that type of thing. So that is definitely, I don't want to say just because it's a theory it's a real thing, but that is definitely something that has been identified as a behavioral pattern. Along the lines of the anti-natalist argument, I feel like there's really some questions around the assumptions that they're making based on perspective. I feel like there's an assumption there that because we know what humanity is, or what being a human means, and everything that comes with that, quote unquote, we also know what not existing means. So they are measuring suffering and happiness based on what we know as humans to be. Well, if you as a human do not exist, then you are not a human. So you cannot necessarily use human attributes to describe that existence, because that existence may or may not be human. We don't know what that existence is. We don't have that perspective. I hope you find this valuable, and I'd really like to hear your opinion on it as well, if you feel so inclined. So thanks again. I really love what you do, and I look forward to hearing your perspective. Thanks.
Thank you for your contribution, bringing behavioral economics into the conversation. I love it when that happens, by the way, when out of left field you get an interesting tidbit from a different discipline entirely that, however, still gives you a new angle on the topic being discussed. It kind of broadens your perspective on the issue at hand. I love that. So thank you. And of course, behavioral economics is one of those fields that I really feel I don't pay enough attention to, and I've never really discussed what little I know of it here on The Great Everything, probably because I know so little. And if I understand you correctly, you're talking about prospect theory, and you say that it posits that our real incentive, or our greatest incentive, is not wanting to lose rather than hoping to make a gain. So what really drives us, or drives us more, is fear of loss rather than hope for gain. And of course, this would be framed in economic terms, given the discipline you're referring to, behavioral economics. But we could broaden that to, pain and suffering and enjoyment and joy, and say that in those terms it really does match the antinatalist intuition, right? That pain and suffering are just more intense than joy and happiness. And so what we should really be trying to do is avoid pain and suffering rather than seek out pleasure and enjoyment. Seems to be two faces of the same intuition, this from prospect theory and the antinatalist position. Maybe it's true. Maybe we are just ultimately looking to avoid bad stuff rather than good stuff. I mean, on a superficial level, that does seem to be the case. We all hope for the good stuff, but what really keeps us awake at night is fear of the bad stuff. It's all the stuff we want to avoid, all the stuff, that we worry about, all our anxieties, the bad stuff that's just beyond the horizon, or that we fear might be beyond the horizon. So, it's a kind of depressing way to look at humanity, that maybe even survival, sort of like our basic drive as living beings, maybe that's a negative value. It's survival simply means avoiding something bad, extinction, rather than looking for something positive, which is living. I wonder. It's certainly something that I hope isn't the case, but it seems to be supported. I mean, behavioral economics also has that really interesting experiment done with the babies, where two babies, I think it was one baby, there was a set of scenarios you could choose between. He could pull a lever and have, say, a tray lowered down with 5 sweets on it, and then a different baby, a stranger, would also get 5 sweets. But that baby could also choose between a different lever where he would get, say, 10 or 20 or 30 sweets, more sweets than in the first scenario, but the stranger, the other baby, would get 50 or 60 or 70, would get more. So the two scenarios are, I can choose, I am being the baby in this scenario, I can choose between fewer sweets where I get an equal amount to the other baby, or far more sweets, so it's a gain for me, but it's a competitive loss because the other baby will get more than me. So sort of trying to tie that in, I don't know if it's appropriate to what you're saying with prospect theory, maybe we are actually incentivized not just by our own loss, but also by competitive loss. We don't want to lose out compared to people around us. Maybe loss really is our greater incentive in life, as in, fear of loss. That's a fascinating way of looking at things. I really hope it's not the case. On your other point, I hear where you're coming from. The asymmetry argument of David Benatar really does rest on, sort of assuming that we know something about what the state of non-existence would be like, which is obviously, as you say, not the case. But just to try and play devil's advocate, I think he's starting out from an atheist perspective, so non-existence literally means just that, the absence of conscious experience, kind of like when you're in a deep sleep or in a coma, which is something that we can't quite express, but we have a vague idea of what it would be like, and that is nothing at all. Of course, if you start positing that there might be some kind of experience in non-existing, well, then that opens up the table to all sorts of speculation, but I don't think that's part of what David Benatar is trying to entail in his analysis. Plus, I think really it's more of a just purely logical argument of this sort of x equals y minus z approach. So I hear where you're coming from, and I think you're probably accurate in what you're saying, but I can also see what David Benatar is doing. Anyway, thank you.
Great everything, Patrick. So, I found, the inherent logic of the antinatalist stance really problematic, right? Mostly because I first look at pain and suffering as distinct phenomena, meaning we've all met someone whose suffering is disproportionate to the pain that they experience. We've also known people who, despite immense pain, suffer very little. So, when I view those as two separate phenomena, they're not just interchangeable. One of them is very much an experience that is almost quantifiable or can be angled at, and suffering, on the other hand, not really. Likewise, I see, there's a palpable difference between the experience of existence, which is calculable, and your antinatalists have made a point of that. But we don't know the benefit and to whom of non-existence, because also they're phenomena like beauty that one will never get to kind of angle at and experience. And for me, a loss of beauty is a real loss. Just a couple quick thoughts as I'm walking through the streets of Anchorville.
Thanks, Reggie. I think we're just using the term interchangeably, pain and suffering. I mean, if you remove the word pain from what I'm saying and just leave suffering, whether physical or psychological, we also remove the linguistic barrier between you and, antinatalism, at least as I described it. Now, on pain thresholds, I actually disagree that you can say that some people suffer disproportionately more or less compared to the pain that they're actually experiencing. What I think you're really saying is that some people's behaviors and their reactions when subjected to pain are more or less reserved, right? The problem is you can't really measure or quantify pain or suffering because they are both entirely subjective. They are an inner experience and as such immeasurable. Because we can't objectively measure how much a pain is suffering. All we can do is measure their behaviors, their outward appearance, whether they go red in the face, they sweat, how they react, they're shouting, they're crying, whether they're tensing their muscles or not, but also, which part of their brain fires up in neuroimaging when they're subjected to pain or other physical stress. What you can measure, therefore, is their reactions, but you can never know the measure of subjective suffering or pain that is being experienced and that those behaviors correspond to. Now, as for your substantive point, though, I really could not agree more. To me, the loss of beauty is a real loss, but also of love and art and pleasure and great food and excitement and friendship and great tactile experiences. All of these things matter to me, and I find them utterly priceless to me. But that's kind of the problem, to me, with how to respond to this antinatalist position, because I find some of it is persuasive, and I do think that there is an axiological asymmetry between pleasure and suffering. And I think that the logical equation of life versus non-life, it kind of makes sense. And what do I have to respond to that? Just arguments about the ineffable, the power of love kind of shit. It's not rigorous, it's irrational. It's kind of like how people who argue for the existence of free will always bring some magical hocus pocus into it, it's like God. It's never logical. So that kind of puts me in front of a choice, a dilemma maybe, to either accept that rationally this antinatalism really has a lot going for it, or maybe accept that I should just give up trying to have a rational argument for this and accept that when it comes to certain things like art and love and the value of existence, which sounds a hell of a lot like the Christian sanctity of all life, maybe in those cases I'm just following my gut, no different from any religious thinker. Maybe that's okay, but I'm not sure I like it, because it means I have no grounds on which to stand to rationally argue my view, at least on this. But I guess leaving that preoccupation with philosophical rigor aside, we're on the same page. Ultimately, the difference between an antinatalist and someone like you and me is that the starting point for antinatalism must be that suffering is so bad that living isn't worth it. And sure, there is good here and there, according to them, but it'll just never justify the cost in terms of suffering to ourselves and other conscious beings. And I just don't believe that. Because I believe in the good in life, in beauty and truth and love and hope, right? My favorite character is Superman. And I think a moment of any of those things, those values, is worth all the suffering I've ever endured. Maybe I just haven't suffered enough to turn my thinking on this, but I've suffered some. And I've also enjoyed the great things life has to offer. And I know exactly how much I'd give up to enjoy them again. As you know, my mother has brain cancer now, and it's bad. She doesn't walk, she doesn't speak anymore, she barely moves. She does recognize me, I think, but that's about it. But what I feel now isn't, I wish I'd never met her. No, I'm thinking, I wish I could have her back like she was when we were happy together. That's what I'm looking for, not non-existence. I want the thing back. My friend Jack, he summed it up perfectly with a text last night after he heard the first half of the show. He said, quote, "Even if life was 95% suffering, which I don't think it is, the potential of the sheer joy of that 5% would still make life worth living." Well said, Jack. Or maybe we're just very lucky. Anyway, people, this has been a pleasure. If you enjoyed this episode, please check out more on iTunes, Google Play, Stitcher, thegreateverything.com, and wherever it is you get your podcasts. And share, leave a review, do all that. Sign up to the newsletter. But above all, catch me again soon on The Great Everything.
Well, arrivederci, Luigi.
The podcast you just heard was recorded with Anchor. If you want to make your own, download the Android or iOS app completely free from anchor.fm/podcast. That's anchor.fm/podcast.